April 12, 1945. 500 feet above the flat, frost-bitten fields outside Aachen, Germany. The sky is a hard, leaden blue, the summer warmth long gone. The air tastes thin and metallic through the oxygen mask. Lieutenant Robert Bobby Hayes clamps his jaw against the wind noise and prays the radio stays clear. He is sitting in the cramped cockpit of a P-51 Mustang. Instrument panel a cramped constellation of glass and bakelite. An oil-stained leather seat, a heavy .50 caliber M2 Browning under his right knee, and the scent of hot machine oil and sweat clinging to his flying suit. His squadron's two-ship has climbed to meet the bomber stream. A single black line of B-17s and B-24s to the east, their corrugated bellies lit like a string of low suns. Flak tracers bloomed beneath them like a second, angry constellation. Hayes to lead, he breathes into the throat mic. We're at altitude. Eyes peeled. Beside him, Flight Lieutenant Alan Mercer, an RAF exchange pilot flying as a lieutenant with the 329th, checks his altimeter again, fingers shivering despite the heated suit. He squints through the glass at the vapor trails stretching like comet tails from piston-engined fighters escorting the bombers. P-51s and P-47s move in fractal practiced patterns. Somewhere below, anti-aircraft bursts flicker and die. Then something else cuts the sky. It isn't thunder or flare. It is a line. A thin, instantaneous slash of metal and light that appears at the edge of vision and is suddenly between them and the bomber stream. For a heartbeat, both men think they have glimpsed a rocket. Impossibly fast, a needle with wings. The sound arrives late, a reluctant small crack of wind. The reaction in the formation is immediate and animal. A chorus of shouted call signs. A percussion of surprised curse words over the intercom. Mercer's hands move on reflex to the throttles. What in God's name, he says. Hayes sees the shape, a blunt-nosed, swept-wing silhouette unlike anything either of them has engaged in a dogfight. Twin compact nacelles, tiny, trumpet-like, sit inboard on the wing roots. The aircraft's fuselage is clean, too clean. There are no radial cowls, no oversized intakes, no thick prop wash. It goes past them as if flung by a giant's finger, and the sunlight tears off its skin in a flash so bright Hayes feels a sting behind his eyes. It is gone in a heartbeat. Then two of them, three of them streak past in the same impossible line, and for the Mustang pilots the world narrows to the memory of speed. Rocket, someone on the frequency says. Uncertain, the single-syllable answer floating like a guess in a dark room. Another voice higher says, Hoax? Luftwaffe test? Hayes's throat is tight. He scans for the contrails but finds none. Only faint, transient heat ripples like the tattered afterglow of a passing meteor. His brain protests, struggling to reconcile what his eyes saw with what flight manuals have trained him to expect. Piston fighters climb, they dive. They do not vanish and reappear. Piston fighters do not overtake bombers in 3-second bursts and disappear. Mercer is already checking his gun sight, flipping the master arm, counting tracer windows with a frozen thumb stare. If those are rockets, they're the cleverest damn rockets in the world, he mutters. He pictures, as all of them do in those rapid-fire seconds, V-2s, buzz bombs, experimental surface-to-air weapons. The radios ping with chatter, a metallic staccato, and no, jets. Jets northwest. Did you see that speed? The word jets lands like an ice bolt. Pilot folklore has hummed with speculative talk of jet propulsion for years, whispered in officers' messes and engineering yards. But to see one, to have one slide past at Mach-like impulse, is another thing. The mind will not accept until the eyes insist. And now every man who has had that flash of motion in his periphery insists. Hayes remembers the first time he learned to estimate speed at altitude, the methodical math of closure rates, the angles and the tick of the gun camera. This does not obey his math. This is a thing that eats seconds and spits out distance. We were told there were prototypes, he says, voice small in the canopy. But not in numbers. Not like this. Below and all around them, the bomber stream struggles through a lattice of black puffs and molten streaks. A B-17 half a wing's breadth away suddenly gapes with shredded fabric and a sputtering engine. The escort fighters flare outward, forming a temporary ring to catch raiders. Hayes slams the stick forward on instinct, pulling into a displacement that will let him take a lead on any attacker. The Mustang's Merlin roars to life, the propeller a high, willing whine, but now it all sounds relatively slow, almost quaint. For the Allied crews, the first reaction is mistrust. Rockets, hoaxes, secret weapons. The second is the cold arithmetic of survival. If these are jets and if they are discreet and fast and appearing in small, surgical groups, then entire tactics must change. The long, steady escort, the methodical circling of bombers, the comfort of climb and dive that piston fighters know intimately. All of it is suddenly vulnerable to a thing that treats time as an optional commodity. A voice on the intercom speaks through the static. This time steadier. Form up. Do not chase, conserve energy. If it's a new fighter, don't get sucked into their speed. Keep close to the bombers. But the temptation to turn and bite back is there, pilot instinct, the ancient predator reflex, a burnished mix of fear and pride. Hayes flexes his fingers around the control column. He is 14 missions into this tour, and has seen comrades go down in a rain of splinters and fire. He does not yet know that in the months ahead the Me 262, the first operational jet fighter the Luftwaffe will field, will produce more such flashes of disbelief, that eyewitness accounts will cycle from rocket to miracle to cheat. For now, in this thin air over Aachen, it is simply an interruption of everything they thought they knew about speed. The bomber gunners begin to shout. 2. The heavy 50s and 20mm cannons below them crack and bloom. But the jet appears to treat those volleys as a trivial annoyance. It is as if someone has rewound the script and given the Luftwaffe a different stage direction. Appear like lightning. Strike like a bluff. Vanish as the formation stabilizes. The older captains on the radios begin to issue curt, practical orders. Report number of jets bearing and altitude. Do not pursue below 2,000 feet. Do not climb above oxygen limits. Operations-level pragmatism overlays immediate panic. Each command is a small, authoritative act that tells pilots a single truth. This encounter is real, and it must be treated with new discipline. Hayes lets his Mustang slide into formation, eyes still searching the sky. Somewhere inside him, a tight personal knowledge, a new question has lodged. How do you fight something that is not supposed to exist? Outside, the clouds press and pull at the horizon, indifferent. The jets will come again. The pilots will learn. But at this moment, as the last sliver of a Me 262 burns away at the edge of sight, all that exists is the sting of astonishment and the thin, metallic taste of something new and frightening racing through the air. While Allied pilots tried to process what they'd seen streaking through the sky, the source of the mystery, deep inside Germany, had already been decades in the making. 4 years earlier, in the cold, gray light of dawn over Augsburg, engineers at Messerschmitt AG had rolled a strange, sleek prototype out of its hangar. It bore none of the brutish, angular features of the Bf-109s or Fw-190s the Luftwaffe relied upon. This new machine looked almost futuristic. The wings swept gently back, its nose sharp and smooth, the fuselage narrow and clean. Beneath each wing hung a strange metallic pod, like twin torpedoes. At its center stood a young test pilot named Fritz Wendel, calm, precise, his gloved hands resting lightly on the cockpit frame as the ground crew pulled away the chocks. The date was July 18, 1942. The machine's designation, Messerschmitt Me 262V3, the world's first operational turbojet fighter. Behind Wendel, a pair of engineers from Junkers nervously eyed their experimental Jumo 04 jet engines, each capable of producing 800 pounds of thrust when if they didn't explode first. These were early days, and jet propulsion was still an unpredictable science. Metallurgy struggled to keep up with the intense heat. Turbine blades melted, bearings cracked, and the engines had to be replaced after just a handful of flight hours. But the promise was undeniable. "Let's see what she can do," Wendell murmured. He advanced the twin throttles. The response was delayed. Jets didn't surge like piston engines. There was a slow, eerie spool-up, a rising metallic whine that grew into a deep predatory roar. The Me 262 began to move, slowly at first, then faster. Dust and small stones whipped behind it as the wheels left the ground. For a brief, shimmering moment, the future took flight. Observers on the ground stared as the aircraft climbed smoothly, accelerating past speeds that would leave any propeller-driven plane gasping. Its silhouette, pure, clean, almost bird-like, cut across the sky with a grace no piston engine could match. Yet it was fragile. Landing one of these early jets was an act of courage and calculation. Lose one engine, and the asymmetric thrust could send the pilot tumbling uncontrollably. The slightest bird strike could flame out both power plants. Still, the Luftwaffe hierarchy, including General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top aces, knew they were looking at a weapon that could rewrite the war in the air. "It's as if angels were pushing," Galland would later say after flying it himself. "You throttle up and suddenly the world moves backward." But there was another man who viewed the Me-262 not as a fighter, but as something else entirely: Adolf Hitler. When shown the aircraft, Hitler's eyes lit up with the same manic glimmer that had doomed so many German innovations to misuse. "Not a fighter," he said. "A bomber. A blitz bomber. Imagine, jet speed carrying explosives over London before they can react." Engineers protested. The airframe was not designed to carry heavy payloads. The internal bomb bays would slow the aircraft and destroy its aerodynamic edge. But Hitler was unmoved. "The war will be won by offense," he insisted. "This is the weapon of revenge." That single command delayed the Me-262's deployment as a fighter by nearly a year the Luftwaffe could not afford. While Allied bombers continued to level German cities and factories, the jet's production line stalled under bureaucratic confusion. Engineers frantically reworked the airframe to accommodate bombs, wiring in hard points that reduced performance and stability. Inside Messerschmitt's factories, tension grew like a storm cloud. Technicians whispered about the wasted potential. It could rule the skies, one mechanic muttered as he watched yet another prototype stripped for Hitler's modifications. "Instead, it will die on the runway." And indeed, many of them did. Allied air raids hit Augsburg and Regensburg repeatedly, targeting assembly lines and runways. Fuel grew scarce. Skilled workers were drafted into infantry service. By 1944, the Me-262 was a marvel without an army, a weapon of the future trapped in a dying regime. But even then, a handful of the jets, the ones that survived the factories, the ones that escaped Hitler's bomber vision, were quietly fitted for combat by desperate Luftwaffe officers who defied orders. They armed them with 4 Mk-108 30mm cannons, each capable of tearing a B-17 apart with a few hits, and stripped them of bomb racks to restore speed. By the spring of 1944, those secret fighters were ready, their pilots drawn from elite Jagdgeschwader 7 Nowotny, trained in near-total secrecy at Lechfeld Air Base. They knew they would be entering a sky filled with hundreds of Allied fighters, aircraft that had owned Europe's airspace for nearly a year. They also knew that once they opened the throttle, nothing with a propeller could catch them. When the Me-262 finally appeared in combat, the effect was immediate and electrifying. It was, as one Allied intelligence officer put it, the closest thing to seeing the future arrive at 500 miles per hour. And yet, for all its power, the jet's arrival would come too late, and into skies too crowded with enemies. But for now, on those first few missions, the Me-262 was pure terror, an apparition that no one quite believed could exist. August 1944, Lechfeld Airfield, near Augsburg. The smell of aviation fuel hung thick in the morning air as mechanics worked in silence, their hands blackened with oil, eyes darting nervously to the horizon. Allied bombers had struck the facility twice that week, leaving twisted hangar beams and cratered runways. Yet in a far corner of the field, 3 strange shapes sat gleaming beneath camouflage netting, their swept wings like the blades of some alien weapon. Oberleutnant Walter Nowotny, the 24-year-old Austrian ace credited with 258 aerial victories, stood beside one of them, his new command, Jagdgeschwader 7 Nowotny, the Luftwaffe's first jet fighter wing. He ran a gloved hand along the fuselage of the Me-262A1A. It was a cruel beauty. 4 nose-mounted Mk-108 cannons, each capable of firing 650 rounds per minute. A top speed exceeding 540 miles per hour, nearly 200 faster than the P-51 Mustang. It could climb like nothing he had ever flown. But it was also fragile, temperamental, and utterly unforgiving. He knew its temperament intimately. The twin Jumo 04 engines were marvels of German engineering and miracles of compromise. Each took 6 weeks to build and, if pushed too hard, might last a dozen flight hours, sometimes less. Rapid throttle changes risked compressor stalls or outright flameouts. The alloy turbine blades, starved of critical metals by wartime shortages, warped under strain. Nowotny's men had learned to coax rather than command their aircraft. "Treat her like a wild horse," he told them. "Smooth hands, steady heart, and never ever chase a prop." That morning, his unit received word that a formation of B-17s was crossing into Bavaria. Escorting them were dozens of P-51s, veterans of hundreds of missions. The order was simple: intercept and disrupt. The jets taxied out onto the scarred runway, their engines spooling with that eerie metallic whine that turned into a rising howl. Ground crewmen crouched with fingers jammed into their ears. Flames licked from the exhausts, brief, ghostly blue. At 0900 hours, Nowotny's Me 262's roared into the sky, one after another, trailing thin ribbons of heat haze. The acceleration was unlike anything the Luftwaffe had ever fielded. Within seconds, the countryside blurred below. They climbed through cloud, broke into the bright sun, and saw their prey, a box formation of American bombers lumbering eastward, their silver skins glittering like shards of glass. Nowotny radioed to his men. "Remember your training. Fast pass, one strike. No turns with the escorts." He rolled, inverted, and dove. Below, the B-17 crews saw them coming, streaks of light at impossible speed. One tail gunner aboard the Sky Queen later described the moment. "They came out of the sun like thunderbolts. I thought it was a rocket at first. There was no propeller, no smoke, just this smooth silver streak. And before I could even shout, it was past us. Then, boom, the guy behind us was gone." The Me 262's 30mm cannons tore through the bomber's aluminum skin as if it were paper. One shell could decapitate a wing. 3 could split the fuselage clean in half. A B-24 disintegrated in a burst of flame, its tail tumbling away like a leaf. The escorts, the vaunted Mustangs and Thunderbolts, reacted instinctively, breaking formation and diving to intercept. But by the time they turned, the jets were already a mile ahead, accelerating through 500 miles per hour and climbing back into the clouds. Their contrails vanished before the Allied pilots could close the distance. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, now flying with the 352nd Fighter Group, was among them. He caught a glint of sunlight, a flash, and saw 2 Me 262s streak past. He jammed the throttle forward, but the Mustang's Merlin engine screamed in protest, the airspeed indicator struggling past 430. "God almighty, they're gone," he muttered into the mic. "They just disappeared." The airwaves filled with disbelief and frustration. One pilot swore he'd seen a German rocket fighter launch from mid-air. Another claimed it was impossible, that no plane could move that fast. But after the second bomber went down, doubt turned to awe. Nowotny's group made 4 passes in under 5 minutes, shooting down 3 bombers and escaping without a single loss. It was the birth of a legend. That evening, Allied intelligence officers met in a dimly lit operations room in London. On the table lay gun camera footage, brief blurred images of a sleek aircraft without propellers. Analysts paused the reels, measuring wingspan, shape, and speed estimates. One officer simply whispered, "This changes everything." Still, they consoled themselves with the belief that Germany couldn't possibly produce these machines in quantity. If they could, the air war might have taken a darker turn. At Lechfeld, Nowotny returned to base and removed his helmet. The smell of burnt fuel and scorched metal clung to the air. His ground crew cheered, but his eyes were heavy. He had seen the future, yes, but he also knew the price. 2 of his pilots hadn't made it back. 1 engine failure, 1 flameout on landing. The jets were as dangerous to their own men as to the enemy. He walked past the twisted wreckage of one crashed Me 262 and said quietly to himself, "Too fast for this world. Too fragile for this war." The age of the jet had begun, but it was born into chaos and its creators were running out of time. September 1944. Somewhere above the Ruhr Valley, the hum of Allied bombers filled the sky like a distant rolling drum. B-17s lumbered through thin layers of cloud, their bellies loaded with ordnance, their gunners scanning every horizon. The war seemed nearly won. But in the last months of the Luftwaffe's life, a new ghost had taken to the air. Lieutenant Robert "Bobby" Hayes was flying cover again in his P-51D Lucky Lulu. The Mustang's engine purred smoothly, a reassuring sound in a sky where reassurance had become rare. He'd flown 30 missions. He'd seen flak tear through wings, engines, and men. But nothing unnerved him like the thing that had appeared 3 weeks earlier, the Me 262. Command had briefed them since then. showing grainy photographs from downed wrecks, diagrams from intelligence reports. The message was clear. This is no hoax. It was real. The Me-262 was faster than any Allied aircraft. It could outrun, outclimb, and outdive everything they had, but it wasn't invincible. The briefing officers emphasized that, repeated it like a mantra. They can't dogfight. Their engines are delicate. Catch them on takeoff or landing. That's when they're slowest. That became the rule. Passed from pilot to pilot like gospel. Hit them when their wheels are down. That morning, as Hayes patrolled above the bomber stream, the call came across the radio, a desperate, ragged voice from another squadron. Bandits, jets. 3 o'clock high. They're diving on the lead formation. Hayes craned his neck and spotted them. Tiny dots against the sun, moving impossibly fast. Within seconds, the dots became shapes. Sleek, silver gray. The twin nacelles glowed faintly, the air behind them shimmering with heat. Holy hell, here they come. The Me-262 swooped down in pairs, their attack runs terrifyingly brief. In less than 30 seconds, 2 B-17s erupted into flames. Gunners fired back wildly, tracers arcing upward, but the jets were already gone, climbing away like lightning in reverse. Hayes pushed the throttle forward. The Merlin engine screamed, propeller tips brushing the edge of the sound barrier. The Mustang shook violently in pursuit. For a moment, it looked like he might close the distance, but then the jet simply accelerated away. Can't touch him, Hayes hissed. Not a damn chance. He leveled off, scanning below. And that's when he saw it. One of the jets turning back toward German territory, descending in a wide arc toward an airfield ringed with anti-aircraft guns. The realization hit him, landing. He radioed his wingman. Eagle 2 with me. We've got one going down to base. They dove, throttles jammed forward. The Me-262 was flaring for approach, engines whining as the pilot tried to bleed off speed. Even at landing pace, the thing was still faster than most aircraft in level flight. But now, finally, it was vulnerable. Hayes lined up the shot. His hands were steady, his breathing slow. Get him before he crosses the runway, he murmured. The 50 caliber guns erupted, 6 synchronized thunderclaps. Tracers stitched across the airfield, striking the Me-262's left wing. The jet jolted, veering sideways, smoke trailing from its nacelle. A heartbeat later, it slammed into the ground and cartwheeled into flame. The radio exploded with cheers. Got one. Hayes nailed a jet. He didn't celebrate. Watching the wreck burn, he only felt the strange weight of disbelief. It was the first time he'd seen one destroyed. Proof that even this phantom machine could die. Back in England that night, in the low amber light of a debriefing room, Hayes described the engagement to an intelligence officer. The man took notes, nodding grimly. So, the officer said finally, they're fast, but not invulnerable. Hayes looked down at his hands, still trembling slightly. No, sir. Not invulnerable, just from another time. Across the channel, the Luftwaffe drew its own conclusions. At Lechfeld, Nowotny's unit had suffered catastrophic losses in just weeks. Not from Allied fighters, but from accidents, mechanical failures, and fuel starvation. The jets consumed aviation fuel faster than Germany could refine it. The Allies, meanwhile, had discovered their vulnerability during takeoff and landing. Mustang squadrons began jet hunting, circling near known bases and striking when the Me-262s tried to return home. In response, the Luftwaffe established new tactics. They built flak belts, rings of heavy anti-aircraft guns, around jet bases to shield landings. They began using older piston fighters like the Bf-109G as decoys to draw Allied patrols away. But none of it was enough. Every sortie was a gamble. Fuel, weather, the unpredictable behavior of those temperamental Jumo engines. Pilots described it like flying with a bomb strapped to each wing. Even so, they kept climbing into the sky, knowing they were flying the fastest, most advanced aircraft ever built, but also knowing that their war and their world was collapsing beneath them. One diary entry from a Me-262 pilot captured the feeling perfectly. The jet is like a miracle. You take off and suddenly everything the Allies built feels old. But when you land, you realize the miracle changes nothing. The Allies could now identify, track, and even trap these machines. But the awe, the shock, remained. As the autumn skies turned gray over Europe, both sides knew the same truth. The Me-262 had changed the laws of air combat, even if it couldn't change the outcome of the war. October 1944. Lechfeld Airfield, southern Germany. Dawn came late and gray, smothered in mist and the smell of burnt kerosene. On the flight line, the Me 262's waited like caged predators, dew clinging to their sleek skin, exhaust nozzles black with soot. The mechanics worked silently, faces pale in the cold. Every hour of daylight was a risk. Allied P-51s had taken to circling these airfields like vultures, waiting for the jets to rise or return. In the operations hut, Major Walter Nowotny stood by a wall map littered with pins and coffee stains. He'd been grounded once already. Hitler himself had ordered him to return to combat, to prove to the world that the jet fighter could still turn the tide. His face looked older than his 24 years. The strain of command, the pressure of expectations, and the loss of his comrades had carved deep lines beneath his eyes. Outside, the jet's engines began to spool up, that haunting metallic whine that built into a shrieking roar. He strapped into his Me 262A1A White 8. The cockpit canopy was still cold to the touch. He ran a gloved hand over the instrument panel, checked the pressures and listened to the turbines as they reached idle. Around him, 2 more jets came alive, exhaust flames licking across the runway like twin torches of defiance. Over the radio, his wingman's voice crackled. "All set, Herr Major. Let's go hunting," Nowotny replied. The takeoff was brutal, the runway short and cratered, the engines sluggish at low speed. He could almost feel the enemy eyes watching from above. Allied Mustangs patrolled near every known jet base, waiting for the telltale smoke trail of a departing Me 262. But once airborne, the danger reversed, and for a few glorious moments, Nowotny was a god among mortals. The Jumo engines surged cleanly and the jet leapt forward. The countryside blurred. Within seconds, the needle crossed 800 kilometers per hour. His body pressed into the seat and the horizon flattened. He banked gently, leveling out toward the northwest, toward the Allied bomber streams over Germany. Minutes later, the dots appeared, B-24s, a dozen at least, moving in box formation. Their contrails hung in thick white ropes against the blue. Nowotny flipped the master arm and aimed for the lead aircraft. At closing speeds like this, combat was reduced to seconds. The Me 262's 4 Mk-108 cannons thundered, a deep chest-pounding rhythm, and shells the size of soda bottles ripped through the bomber's wing. The American machine lurched, then folded in half, flames blooming through its midsection. Nowotny dove through the formation, a silver phantom moving too fast for gunners to track. Another bomber erupted behind him, but as he pulled up, he felt the left engine cough. A sharp drop in power followed by a shudder. He glanced at the gauges. Oil pressure dropping. A compressor stall. He throttled back carefully, praying the turbine wouldn't seize. White 8 to control. Engine failure port side. Returning to base. The response was drowned in static. He turned east, limping on one engine. The Me 262's greatest strength, its raw speed, now betrayed him. On one turbine, it flew like a wounded bird. The climb rate fell. The airframe shuddered with every gust. He dropped lower, scanning the terrain for Lechfeld's runways. Then he saw them. 3 tiny silver dots, low over the treetops. Approaching fast, Mustangs, they'd been waiting. The Allied pilots dove in, guns blazing. Tracers streaked across the gray sky. Nowotny twisted instinctively, but the jet was sluggish, unresponsive. The second engine began to flame. The control stick vibrated violently in his hand. Control, this is White 8. Both engines out. The radio cut. From the ground, villagers near Emsalo saw the burning jet spiral out of the clouds, trailing black smoke, before striking the earth in a ball of fire. Nowotny never made it out. The wreckage scattered across the forest, pieces of the world's most advanced aircraft burning in the wet leaves. The Luftwaffe lost its greatest jet ace that day. Within hours, Allied intelligence intercepts recorded his death. For many of the Me 262 pilots, it felt like an omen. But even as the jet's ranks thinned, new names began to rise. Men like Heinz Baer, Georg Peter Eder and Franz Schall, veterans, who had survived hundreds of dogfights in piston fighters and now found themselves mastering machines that seemed to come from another century. They learned to fight with precision and restraint. The Me 262 could never dance in a dogfight, but in a high-speed ambush it was lethal. They perfected the art of the boom and zoom. Attack, fire, vanish. Allied pilots began calling them silver comets. Reports circulated of jets cutting through bomber formations with surgical precision, leaving burning aircraft in their wake. But for every victory, a dozen technical failures, fuel shortages, or surprise attacks on landing claimed more jets. The Luftwaffe's desperation was palpable. By November 1944, the jet program operated under near-constant Allied bombardment. Airfields were cratered, supply lines shredded, and fuel depots destroyed. Yet still, the Me-262s launched, sometimes from grass strips, sometimes from roads. One German mechanic wrote in his diary, "We are flying the future from the ruins of the past." Each launch is a miracle. Each return is luck. For the men inside those cockpits, it was no longer about victory. It was about proving that even in collapse, they could still terrify the sky. And they did. For every Allied pilot who claimed a kill, another whispered quietly that he had seen something impossible. Something that had passed him like lightning and disappeared into history. March 1945, Munich. The Reich was dying. Railways lay shattered. Cities were fields of broken glass and fire. And yet, above the ruins, the Me-262 still flew. What remained of Jagdgeschwader 7 and Kommando Nowotny was now a patchwork of exhausted pilots, overworked mechanics, and half-repaired aircraft. The jets were kept running by ingenuity and sheer willpower. Mechanics salvaged engine parts from wrecks. Fuel was siphoned from trucks, even from crashed aircraft. Each sortie was a gamble, between engine failure, Allied ambush, or simply running out of sky before fuel ran dry. On a misty morning near Landsberg am Lech, one of those final missions began. Oberleutnant Franz Schall climbed into his Me-262A, nicknamed Gelbe II. His face was pale, his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. The war had reduced even the proudest fighter units to small, desperate knots of survivors. Still, orders had come. Intercept American bombers moving toward Nuremberg. The engines coughed, then shrieked to life. The ground crew gave him a silent thumbs up. As the Me-262 rolled down the broken runway, Schall caught sight of the horizon. Gray smoke rising in every direction, columns of Allied armor advancing across Bavaria. He knew it was over. Everyone did. But he opened the throttles anyway. The engines screamed, and once again the jet leapt forward, defying gravity and defeat alike. He climbed into the open sky, where war still obeyed different laws: speed, angle, surprise. At 20,000 feet he spotted them, B-24s, hundreds of them crawling east in tight formation. The bomber crews spotted the streaking shapes too late. The Me-262 sliced through the formation at over 540 miles per hour. In seconds, two bombers were burning, their wings folding, parachutes scattering into the thin air. But the jet pilots couldn't celebrate. On their tail came swarms of P-51 Mustangs, diving fast, patient, and predatory. The Allies had learned. They no longer chased the jets in open sky. They waited near the bases, ready to strike when the Me-262s slowed to land. Schall broke away, descending rapidly, engines screaming. The Mustangs followed. Down below, anti-aircraft gunners at Lechfeld opened fire, black clouds of flak bursting around the American fighters. One P-51 peeled off trailing smoke, hit by friendly fire, but the rest pressed in. Schall dropped his landing gear and flared hard, tires screeching against the cracked runway. He barely managed to roll to a stop before the first Allied bombs hit the far end of the field. He sat there in the cockpit for a moment, staring at the burning horizon, the engines ticking as they cooled. The war was ending, and with it, the short, violent life of the Me-262. Across Germany, the remaining jets were scattered and hidden, under camouflage nets, in barns, in forest clearings. Some were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. Others were seized intact by advancing American, British, and Soviet troops. In one of the more surreal moments of the war's end, U.S. Army engineers found an entire line of Me-262s abandoned on a country road, sleek, futuristic shapes amid wagons, bicycles, and retreating civilians. The soldiers stood silently, realizing they were looking at a weapon years ahead of its time. Within weeks, captured Me-262s were shipped back to Allied test facilities. Pilots in the U.S., Britain and the USSR took them aloft, studying their aerodynamics and jet systems. The verdict was unanimous: revolutionary. Dangerous, but revolutionary. In the skies of California and Farnborough, the jet age truly began. The Gloucester Meteor, Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, and MiG-9 all drew heavily from the Me 262's lessons. Its strengths and its flaws. Even its enemies couldn't deny its influence. For the men who had faced it, those who had watched it streak past them like a phantom, the memory of that first encounter never faded. Lieutenant Bobby Hayes, years after the war, sat in a veterans' reunion and described it once more. It came out of nowhere. No sound at first, just this glint, this streak of light that passed me like I was standing still. I thought it was a rocket. We didn't believe it was a plane, but it was. It was real. And in that moment, I realized the world had changed. He was right. The Me 262 had not saved the Reich, but it had changed the future of flight forever. It was a glimpse of the next war, born too soon, too few, and too flawed to alter its own. In the end, it was both a weapon and a warning. That technology, no matter how advanced, cannot rescue a cause already lost. As spring came to Europe and the guns finally fell silent, the Me 262's engines went quiet for good. But in their fading echo lay the sound of the coming age, the age of jet power, of speed beyond imagination, of men once bound to the propeller finally breaking free of it. And somewhere above the ruins in the endless sky you can almost still imagine it, a silver shape flashing past like lightning, the first whisper of the future.